Good evening and welcome everybody to Genetics and Cancer with Gilda's Club Kansas City. We are so happy to have Carmen Williams with us tonight, who is with the St. Luke's Genetics. And on that note, I'm going to hand it on over to her and let her introduce herself too.
Fantastic, thank you. Yes, I am Carmen Williams. I work in cancer genetics at St. Luke's. I am originally from the state of Nebraska and moved all over the country before I landed in Chicago during my training years. Chicago, and then I have worked in Michigan, back in Chicago, and now I'm here in Kansas City, a little closer to home. So it's nice to be with you tonight, and it's going to be, it's always exciting to talk more about how genetics is playing a role in cancer. This is an area that's just going to keep exploding with potential and possibilities. And I think genetics has the potential to give people a sense of what may be coming in the future, to prepare for that and to hopefully help keep people healthy, as well as now it's becoming a really important part of treatment and making sure that we're able to have the right treatment for the right tumor. And that is starting to bring up breakthroughs in treatment that we hadn't seen in a very long time. So I'm excited to share some of that with you tonight. And we will do all the questions at the end, so feel free to write them down as we're going. I'll try and leave plenty of time for questions that you have. So to begin with, I just want to mention that for a period of time, I was in the Speakers Bureau for AstraZeneca, which is a pharmaceutical company, and they produce medication that is used in cancer treatment. And that's why I did that. So I'll let you know about that. I don't think it'll have a huge role in our discussion tonight, but and then some of the slides that I'm using tonight were prepared by a colleague of mine named Brittany Simonak, and she let me use a few of these slides that she did a really nice job on. So I want to give her credit for that. So I'd like to start by just talking about what genetic counselors are. A lot of my patients ask this, and it's becoming more and more well understood as patients and individuals are starting to see genetic counselors more. But there's a specialized training that happens for genetic counselors in both medical genetics and psychosocial counseling. And at this time, there are a little over 5,000 genetic counselors that are practicing in the US. So not that many of us. If you broke it down by state, that would round out to about 100 of us per state, but some states have none, like Wyoming has maybe one or two. And then other states like New York and Illinois and California have lots and lots of counselors. So the process to become a genetic counselor requires a master's degree in genetic counseling. And then we have to be board certified by the American Board of Genetic Counseling. So it's good to know that that is in place. Genetic counselors work in a lot of different settings, not just cancer. We also have genetic counselors in the prenatal world, helping women do testing related to pregnancies, and as well as pediatrics, helping children who have genetic conditions. There are some genetic counselors that work primarily in research and not so much in the hospital setting. And genetic counselors can work in industry, like working for a genetic testing company or working for a biotech company or pharma company. And then some genetic counselors work in very specialized clinics like neurology and cardiology. So it's a pretty broad profession. And if you or anyone you know was ever looking for a genetic counselor to go see to get a consultation, a really great way to find that out anywhere in the country is to go to nsgc.org and use their Find a Genetic Counselor function. It lets you put in a zip code, and then it'll help you find genetic counselors in the area. But to the business. So for tonight, we're going to talk about Genetics 101. We're going to just get a baseline in genetics and biology to help you understand some complicated things. And then we're going to talk about Genetics 201, about hereditary conditions that can cause cancer. And then last, we're going to talk about Genetics 301, which is the latest, where we're doing DNA testing of tumors and what's going on in that realm. So some of you may recognize this. This is where a lot of people and most of my patients start, and this may be the extent of biology understanding for most people, is big A, little a. A lot of us, when we did high school biology, we're doing Punnett squares to talk about how genetic traits can be passed down. But if you make it a little more complicated, this is a picture that helps represent what our genetic information looks like. If you were to take a cell, all of the DNA is contained in the middle of the cell in the nucleus, and the biggest packaging of DNA is called a chromosome. That chromosome, if you unwound it, would break down into smaller pieces of DNA that we call genes, and each gene has a very specific function, a thing that it does. Even within the genes, you can break it down further into nucleotides, and so that's the code that we talk about, the A's, C's, T's, and G's that we use to represent the genetic code. So some of those terms will come into play tonight. And when we do any kind of genetic testing or evaluation, it's helpful to know a few terms. So what we have found out through things like the Human Genome Project is we have a pretty good idea of the reference sequence. What should DNA look like when it's normal in a human? And when we do any kind of a genetic test, we'll compare a person's DNA to those reference sequences that we think are the correct spelling of the genetic code. If there's something that's different from the reference sequence, just a very neutral term we give that, not good or bad, just different, is called a variant. Variant is just a very easy way to say this is not quite the same. A variant can be a problem. If it's a problem and if it's causing the gene to stop working, we call that a mutation, or sometimes you might hear the term pathogenic mutation, pathogenic variant. Or if that change is something we don't recognize, but we're not quite sure if it's a problem, we will often call those a variant of uncertain significance, or VUS. Genes are a very important part of preventing cancer. So there are specific genes like BRCA1 and BRCA2, or sometimes you might hear them called BRCA. And there are a few dozen other genes that are important in preventing cancer from developing. And if a cell has too many mutations in these cancer-preventing genes and they can't do their job, that's what makes cancer more likely to develop. So what does cancer look like if we could take a picture of these cells? So this right here is what a normal human cell looks like if we took a picture of the genetic information. That ball in the corner is the nucleus. If we broke it open, this is all the chromosomes that would spill out. And if we line them up all neat, on the left-hand side in the box, you see what a full complement of human DNA looks like. Those are all the chromosomes, 23 pairs, perfectly paired, perfectly matched. That's what it's supposed to look like. But in cancer, all of that goes awry. And if we were to open up the nucleus of a cancer cell and dump it out, this is a little bit more of what we would see. So on the left, you can still see the normal DNA. And on the right, you see what a prostate cancer cell looks like. And so where we're supposed to have 2 copies of each chromosome, now we've got 3, 5. Looks like some of them have little bits of other chromosomes stuck to them, and they're kind of just a mess. And so that's the problem, is the DNA, the genetics of these cells went wrong, and that's why they start growing out of control. Another terminology that gets used now a lot more is trying to figure out whether something is a mutation that was inherited or if it's something that developed later on in life in a single cell. So the word somatic is a term that gets used a lot, and soma is a Greek word that means body. So you think of it as a mutation that happens somewhere else in the body, but not from the very beginning. It occurs in one cell of a fully formed person, so maybe a breast cell or a colon cell, and these are not inherited. So somatic mutations are not hereditary. The other word is germline mutations, and germ is related to the Latin word germen, which means like the seed or the bud of a plant. It's the original cell. So think germination. So germline mutations occur in the original egg or sperm. These are inherited, and it's a mutation that is then copied into every single cell in that person's body. So here's a more picture representation of these types of mutations. On the left, you see somatic mutations within that red box. So somebody's normal cells picked up a mutation along the way. That's a somatic mutation, and then more, and then more. Those are all somatic. But on the right side, you see that the cells from the very beginning all had a mutation in them to start with. Those are germline mutations. And then if additional mutations happen, those are later somatic. So generally speaking, most cancers are not caused by anything hereditary. And that's a surprise to a lot of people. It's really only 5 to 10% of cancers that are caused by something that's being passed down through the family. About 70% of cancers are sporadic. So they happen by chance, maybe related to environmental factors, sometimes related to things we don't quite understand just yet. And then a small portion of cancers, about 20%, are something that we can't really explain with a genetic cause, but we see more of a pattern in that family that tells us there may be some kind of a familial risk we just don't have a good test for. We're not able to specifically identify. But in somebody with a familial risk, we may need to change screening a little bit. So moving on then, let's talk about those hereditary conditions. So there are now a little over 50 known syndromes where a single gene causes multiple cancers in the same family, and potentially in some cases can cause multiple cancers in one individual. And what we are looking for in the specialty that I work in cancer genetics is defectiveness in cancer preventing genes. If there's a gene that's defective, then we can do something about that. What we know is that if one of those genes is defective, then it tells us that certain types of cancer, if we look at a person's lifetime, so on the bottom of that graph, that's age 20 and 30 and 40 and age 50 at the end, what we see in hereditary syndromes is that people get cancer at younger ages, and people are much more likely to get those kinds of cancer. And so if we find that information, we can help by changing somebody's medical care. And we can either screen more effectively for certain kinds of cancer, or we can in some cases help prevent cancers, either through surgical interventions or sometimes medical medications that we can give people. And it can be kind of complicated. It's not always easy to follow all those guidelines, but it's very effective at helping us keep people healthy, even if they have these genetic conditions. And then the last thing this information is really helpful for is cascade testing, is the word we use for it, or testing other family members. So once we found a condition in a family, then we can start offering that testing to other family members to see if they have the genetic condition as well. And if in most of the conditions that we know about, there's a 50% chance that if one parent has the genetic condition, there's a 50% chance that they might pass it on to each of their children. So it's not a guarantee that everybody in the family would have it, and we have to continue testing to help figure that out. But if we find it in people who haven't had cancer yet, we have a great opportunity to help keep them alive long term, to help keep them as healthy as possible, because now we know what might be coming and it won't surprise us. If somebody goes to see a genetic counselor, this is a little bit of what the process looks like. A doctor will usually be the one that figures out, oh, hey, my patient needs to go see a genetic counselor, and so they'll refer a person. And when they come to see us, one of the first things we do is ask way more questions than anybody has the answer to about their family. And I like to joke that nobody knows all the answers to all of my questions, but I'm going to ask them all anyway, because we need to get as much information as they have. And let's be honest, nobody's sitting around at the Thanksgiving dinner table talking about colonoscopies and cancer treatments, or at least not in many families. Some families do. So we get 3 generations of the family, because what we're looking for are patterns in that family, multiple cancers and multiple people with cancer. And then we do counseling, where we talk about what information those genetic tests could tell the person, what are the chances we might find something that's abnormal, and what can be done with that information, and making sure people know about things like legal protections that are in place if they get an abnormal genetic test result. Then we will help do the testing and select the right genetic test for people. And once the results come back, we go through those results with the individual, discuss what they mean, and discuss what next steps there are for those people and their families. If there's something positive or abnormal, the genetic counselor will also help get somebody hooked up with specialists that can help them then with all the recommendations that are made for that syndrome. Genetic counselors also can be helpful in initiating that testing in other family members. It's not easy to convey information like this, to share information about having a genetic syndrome with family members. And so that's one of the things we try to really support our patients in, is knowing how to share that information. and even giving them tools that make it less burdensome for them to share that. So now I'm going to talk a little bit more about some specifics, and a lot of the talks that you'll hear genetic counselors give, we'll talk a lot about hereditary breast cancer, hereditary ovarian cancer, and we're going to include some of that information tonight as well. But one of the things that's changing in the field of cancer genetics, especially around the BRCA genes and Lynch syndrome and a few other conditions, is we've realized that prostate cancer is a much bigger problem in these families than we had realized before, and that we're missing out on providing preventative care and also identifying people that might be at risk and families that might be at risk if we're ignoring prostate cancer. So I'm going to talk through that lens tonight. We're still talking about the BRCA genes and the Lynch syndrome genes, but for anybody that has thought about, well, there might be breast cancer in the family, cancer often goes hand in hand in families with breast cancer. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that. We are most concerned that there could be some kind of hereditary condition in someone with prostate cancer when that prostate cancer is metastatic or is spread to other parts of the body. If we took all the men with metastatic prostate cancer and did genetic testing, we'd find that about 15 to 20% of them are hereditary. So that's a little bit higher than what we see on the whole with cancer. We also see a genetic cause, and sometimes if there's multiple generations of prostate cancer in close relatives like fathers and sons, and especially if we start to see cancers diagnosed at younger ages. If we see a person with prostate cancer and they have at least 2 close relatives with some kind of a cancer related to a syndrome, then, and especially if those other cancers are diagnosed under the age of 50, those are also clues that there could be a hereditary type of prostate cancer and a hereditary syndrome. So if we see prostate cancer with breast cancer under age 50, or ovarian cancer or pancreatic cancer, those are patterns that are concerning for something like a BRCA mutation. Or if we see prostate cancer with colon cancer and uterine cancer, that's a pattern we see sometimes with families that have Lynch syndrome. And then we know that individuals of Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry have a much, much higher chance of having a BRCA1 or BRCA2 mutation. In fact, they are 10 times more likely than an average person to have a BRCA mutation. So anytime we see prostate cancer and Jewish ancestry, we want to think about genetic testing. So within prostate cancer, if we took that little piece of the pie that is genetic causes for prostate cancer, and we looked at which genes are the most likely to find, BRCA1 and BRCA2 are the ones that we see most often in men with prostate cancer who have a hereditary cause. So there again, there's that connection back to breast cancer. And if we see a man with prostate cancer and we figure out that it's BRCA, that's really helpful not only for him, but we can also test all the family members and find other men in the family that are at risk for prostate cancer. We can find other women in the family that are at risk for breast cancer and ovarian cancer, and we can get ahead of the game. So results in genetics are a little bit more complicated than just positive and negative. So we can, with genetic test results, find a positive result, something's abnormal, and we need to make changes based on a genetic syndrome. We can find a negative result, which means no mutations were found, and we just base everything from that point forward on what we see in that individual, and if there's some kind of a familial tendency for something like breast cancer or colon cancer, but nothing genetic. And there's something that we call a true negative. True negative is exciting. It's when we see a family where we've identified a gene mutation, we've identified that there's a genetic syndrome, and one of the family members tests negative, they don't have the syndrome. That person who's a true negative goes back to average cancer risks. So even though there may be a very daunting picture of lots of cancers in the rest of the family members, that true negative person only has to do average risk screening and is not at those high risks for cancer. And then the last possibility is a variant of uncertain significance, which we talked about earlier, and that's when we get something inconclusive. The good thing to know if ever you run into somebody or if you yourself have had genetic testing, these variants of uncertain significance are 90% of the time eventually moved into the normal or negative category. So they're usually not cancer causing, and we don't get too worked up about them. But 10% of them do get moved into a positive or mutation category. And so we always encourage anybody with a result like that to make sure they stay in touch with a genetics person and call them every once in a while to see if that has been reclassified. So there are a few different reasons that people will sometimes do genetic testing. One of the reasons is it can potentially provide an explanation for the cancers in the family, or in some cases it helps rule out a concern that there might be something hereditary. It can identify if a person is at increased risk for other types of cancer. So if a man has prostate cancer and he has a BRCA mutation, he also has a high risk or a higher than average risk of having male breast cancer, which is very rare. And that's something that his doctors need to know about. If a woman has a breast cancer and has a BRCA mutation, she's also at risk for ovarian cancer, and we can do a lot to help prevent ovarian cancer. And so that's important to know. So that can be helpful, by a helpful reason to do genetic testing. Genetic testing can help prevent another cancer from occurring, or it can identify it a little bit earlier when it's easier to treat. And we can personalize a lot of our recommendations there. It can also help us determine if other family members are at increased risk. That's where it's really helpful when we do testing and we find that there isn't a genetic cause for cancer. It can also provide a lot of reassurance for other family members that they don't need to be as concerned that they are at really high risk. And then we're getting to a point now where genetic testing like this for hereditary conditions might have implications for treatment. I'll talk more about that in a minute. But let's talk a little bit about what it looks like then. So what are these risks for cancer? And I'm going to use BRCA as my example tonight. So if we see a BRCA mutation, on the left-hand side of this column, you'll see what an average person's risk for cancer is. So just anybody without any kind of a genetic condition. In the middle column is the risk for that cancer in somebody with BRCA2 mutation. And then on the right-hand side is BRCA1 mutation. So men with BRCA mutation have higher rates of prostate cancer. On average, it's 11%, and it goes up to 20 to 30% with BRCA2 mutation. And so where doctors kind of hem and haw and say, you know, men don't necessarily need to screen for prostate cancer. If there's a BRCA mutation, we say they definitely should be screening for prostate cancer. The risk of male breast cancer is extremely low for an average risk man. It goes up to about 5 to 6% in a BRCA2 mutation carrier, and it's a little bit increased in BRCA1, although not as much. We can also see melanoma skin cancer in both men and women with BRCA mutations at higher rates, not as severely, but a little bit higher. And then women have a significantly increased risk of breast cancer. Average risk is 12%, and with BRCA, it goes up from 50 to 80% risk of breast cancer. And so that's something we have to take action on. Ovarian cancer risk is a bit higher. And then in some families, mostly related to the BRCA2 gene, we can also see an increased risk for pancreatic cancer. The good news is we have guidelines to help us take care of people even with these higher risks. And we have screening tests. In some cases, we have preventative measures that we can take. And so you can see in this chart the different ages where we would recommend starting some of those things. You know, where an average risk woman would start her mammograms at 40, with BRCA, we start at age 25. So there are a lot of differences that this brings in. One of the questions that is appropriate and a concern that people have is, what happens if somebody finds out I have a gene mutation? Can they take away my health care? Can they harm me in any way? So the answer is the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. This is a federal law, so it applies across the US and every state, and it's passed in 2008. It is not the Affordable Care Act, so whatever happens in the future to that will not impact this particular law. And there are two main things that it does. It prevents health insurance companies from discriminating, so they can't raise premiums or deny policies to people because of a gene mutation. and it helps protect against employment discrimination, because employers often provide health plans, and they might be tempted to exclude somebody from a job if they thought they might raise their health insurance costs. So employers don't even get to ask about genetic information that's illegal, not as a part of the interview process, or not at any point along the way. There are exceptions, so this law does not apply to life insurance companies or long-term disability companies. And it also does not apply if companies have fewer than 20 employees. They get an exception. So there's more information online if anybody wants to go online and look and see more about that law. All right, so a few take-home points about hereditary genetic testing. Will testing change treatment? It could if somebody has cancer. Will it tell someone what their risk of cancer recurrence is? So for someone who already has cancer, will hereditary testing tell them if that cancer is going to come back? And the answer is no. This isn't a test that tells us cancer is more aggressive if it's there, nothing like that. It's just simply telling us if we can explain why that cancer might have happened in the first place, and it tells us there may be other risks for cancer. Can it tell family members if they are at risk? Yes, hereditary testing can tell us that. And can it tell you if you're at risk for getting a second kind of cancer? Yes, it can also explain whether someone would have a higher risk for some other kinds of cancer. All right, now moving on to Genetics 301. Are you ready for this? Here we go. This is where it gets really interesting. So let's go back to this picture and remind ourselves a little bit about the difference between somatic and germline mutations. So again, somatic mutations are ones that have happened later on after somebody is fully developed in one single cell that develops mutations somewhere else in the body. Germline mutation is one that is hereditary, that someone is born with and that's in every cell in their body. So there are some different types of tumor DNA testing that are being done now. So looking at those somatic mutations, one of the tests that is happening now is called solid tumor testing, or next generation sequencing, or NGS is another term you might hear used for this. So what happens is they have to get a biopsy sample. So from the original tumor, they take some cells and they test the DNA. The strengths of this particular test is they get a lot of DNA because they're getting a lot of cells from the biopsy. And it's effective at very early stages in cancer because we're going directly to the tumor. And this one is the gold standard for tumor DNA testing right now. It gives the most accurate information and the biggest breadth of information. But there are some limitations. It's not always possible to get tumor tissue because it has to be done through a biopsy. And in some cases, there just may not be enough tissue. It also is limited because sometimes biopsies will have happened 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 years before the doctor wants to do this particular tumor test. And believe it or not, in the hospitals, they are legally required to keep all these tumors stored for a certain amount of time, at least 7 to 10 years in most states, and sometimes they keep them even longer. But tumors can actually change and mutate even more over time. And if we test tumor DNA from 10 years ago, it might not be accurate to what the tumor looks like genetically today. And so that's one of the limitations of this. A different type of tumor test that can be done is called a liquid biopsy, you may have heard. Another name we use is cell-free DNA. And so what they are able to do is just a blood draw. And in the blood sample, they're able to tell the difference between that person's DNA from their blood cells and DNA that's coming from tumor cells that might be circulating through the bloodstream. So it's a very easy test to do because it's just a blood test. And it might get DNA results from multiple different tumor sites if somebody has tumor that has gone to other parts of the body. And it also, because it's so simple, it allows for dynamic monitoring. So they could do a blood test in January and do another one in June and do another one the next January, and they can see how things are changing over time. But one of the limitations of this test is it can only detect tumor DNA that's been sloughed off of the tumor and is in the bloodstream. And that's really most often the case when a cancer is at later stages. So this is not always effective at detecting all the tumor types, and it's not always effective in early stage cancers. So when they're doing this testing, these somatic tumor tests, there are a lot of ways they can use that information. One of them is that a lot of specific tumors will have almost like a genetic thumbprint, a specific pattern of different mutations that tell doctors what type of cancer it is. In some cases, it can help them predict which drugs should be used, and they can actually target specific genes. And in some cases, it will help the doctors understand what's the prognosis. So if they look at the various DNA thumbprints of the tumor, it can help them say this tumor is more aggressive or this tumor is less aggressive. And that can help them decide if they need to be more aggressive in their treatments. And then the last thing that is less useful right now, but I think we'll be building in the future, is figuring out what dosage of certain medications to use. That's another way that this kind of DNA information can be used. And when it works, when we find a target, it is remarkable. So this is a picture from an article that was published in the New York Times Magazine in 2010. 10 years ago already, this was starting to develop. So on the left, what you see is this is a PET scan, and you can kind of see the outline of the body. If you've seen a PET scan before, you know what you're looking at. But if you've never seen one, everywhere in the picture that it's really black and dark is a place where there's cancer. And this is a patient that had stage 4 metastatic melanoma, skin cancer. So you can clearly see it's all throughout his bones and even into his brain. And they tested the DNA of this tumor and found out there was a mutation in a gene called BRAF, B-R-A-F. And they had a drug called a BRAF inhibitor that they gave to this patient. And so on the left is this patient with metastatic stage 4 melanoma. On the right is 3 to 4 weeks after he started taking the BRAF inhibitor. And you can see that all the cancer has just dissolved and disappeared. It was remarkable. And so if we can find the right targets and the right treatment that gets at the DNA of that tumor, we can do remarkable things. Now, cancer is a lot more complicated than just one problem and one solution. And unfortunately, in this particular situation with melanoma, within about 4 to 6 months, the melanoma had returned because there were a few different cells that had broken off the original and had lost that BRAF mutation, and they stuck around and then came back. So we have to keep fighting on multiple fronts when we use this science. But the promise of the science being able to really make a huge difference is really exciting. So a few take-home points about this kind of tumor DNA testing. Will testing change treatment? It's possible. If someone has cancer and they do a DNA test on the tumor, what we're seeing right now is somewhere between 10 to 15% of people are able to find a new treatment to do based on that testing. So not everybody, not even most people yet, but for some people it can be really helpful. Can it help the physician decide which chemo regimen to use? In some cases, yes, it can be very helpful for that. Can it tell someone what their risk of cancer recurrence is? It can help a little bit with that prognosis. Can it tell family members if they're at risk? No, this tumor DNA testing is mainly somatic. There are a couple of labs that will do both somatic and germline hereditary testing side by side. And so in that case, yes, potentially some of that information can be done. But the point of this tumor DNA testing is more related to treatment. And then can it tell someone if they're at risk for getting a second type of cancer? No, not unless we do one of those tests that has the hereditary component. Here on the last page are a few resources that I like to give everyone in case you would like to go look up more things and check this out further. So there's a website called Genetics Home Reference, and if you ever have a test or a gene that somebody tells you about and you want to go look it up, this is a pretty good place to get just some very high level information about a lot of different genes. There's a cool study that is going on right now in the US. It's being funded by the National Institute of Health, and it's called the All of Us study. So they are trying to collect 1 million people, and with that 1 million people in their cohort, they're going to sequence everybody's genome. And then they're going to follow all of their patients over the course of 10, 15, 20 years to help learn a lot more information about all of our genetics and how it impacts our health. So I think it's a really cool study. If you like to get involved in research, it might be a cool one to enroll in. Otherwise, you can just kind of check it out and see what they're learning and what they're doing. Getting information about family history is very challenging. So this next website, the Surgeon General's Family History Tool, is a good one that can actually allow somebody to input in a secure way online their whole family history, and it can create links to send to other family members. So if somebody wanted to go ahead and email a lot of different sisters and brothers and cousins and have them all go put their health information into this tool, they could do it that way, and this would collect all of that. So that's kind of nice. And then if anybody likes to read and likes entertaining reading that has to do with genetics, there's a book called The Violinist's Thumb by a man named Sam Keen. He's a great author. He talks about the specifics of genetics in a way that's really accurate, but also very easy to digest and understand. And he tells some really great and interesting stories. So I always recommend that one if anybody wants to look a little bit further. And with that, I will take any questions, although I will leave this up for just a moment for the video so that anybody that likes a good cartoon can read through it briefly. But whenever we are ready, we can go ahead and with questions.